expansion or clarification is that while I have been very much focused on working on medical and therapeutic uses, what's made my job more complicated but also more interesting is that I've also been trying to legalize for all purposes. So we've had this parallel track. One is drug policy reform. The other is work through the FDA and other regulatory agencies around the world for medical and therapeutic. And one of the things that we've really found by looking, and I talked about this yesterday or the other day at Necker Island, is that the medicalization changes people's minds about both medical and also about legal. So the medicalization leads the way towards legalization. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you mostly just about MDMA, but there'll be a little bit here that's also about psilocybin and other substances. So started MAPS in '86. I'm speaking to you not as a representative of Lycos. Lycos has a much more different approach towards communication policies, which is the less the better, according to them. And so, and we started MAPS. I started MAPS in '86, and 2014 is when I started started MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. And one of the things that's sort of humbling and good for my humility is that when I started MAPS, when I got my PhD in 2001, I thought I knew everything about the development of medicines through the FDA, particularly psychedelics. And even in 2001, I had assumed that MDMA would automatically become a generic drug because the molecules in the public domain, the use for MDMA for PTSD, I learned about MDMA in '82. It was used for PTSD before I even learned about it, so I thought there was no real patents that would be protective, so I thought it was immediately going to go to be a generic. And what I didn't realize till 2014 is that there was laws that Ronald Reagan created in 1984 to provide incentives for developing drugs that were off patent, and those were called data exclusivity, which was different from a patent. It means that you had your own exclusive use of your data if you were a company trying to make a drug into a medicine, and that it could not be used by another company to argue for generics for 5 years. And then if you do studies in children, pediatric studies, which the FDA is actually requiring more and more, you get an additional 6 months of data exclusivity. So once I realized that there was this opportunity to have this period where other companies could produce their own data, that's how it's different than a patent, but it would take them so long. So once I realized that there was this potential to have a product that you could charge more than a generic, then I realized that there was a different story we could tell to our donors. Because MDMA-assisted therapy is really what it means is it assists therapy for a lot of different things. So even though we've focused on MDMA for PTSD, it could be used for many other things. And so instead of we would keep going back to donors for more money to make it into PTSD, now more money for postpartum depression, now more money for social anxiety or whatever things, that we could develop a corporation that would end up generating resources that could be used for developments. And the idea was that the nonprofit would be the 100% owner of the for-profit. And then the profits from the for-profit could be used for public benefit for other purposes. What happened, unfortunately, is that we became the victims of our own success, so that we ended up creating a pathway through the FDA. And in 2017, we got permission to go to phase 3, and we had this special protocol assessment. And that sort of cleared the way so that other people could realize that this wasn't just something that had to be philanthropic, because there was really no way through the FDA that people could do this investments. And that led to this creation of hundreds now of for-profit psychedelic companies. And what was then it became more difficult for us to raise the remaining money we needed from donors because there were so many investment opportunities. And so that's how I sort of lost control over this whole company, because then we started having to take in investors. And so that's what has now changed things. And I think to the detriment, but that's a bigger story. I think here it was MAPS. I started April 8th, 1986, and our 38th anniversary was April 8th this year, and it turned out that this was the solar eclipse through the United States. So we felt the universe is now celebrating the anniversary of MAPS, and so we had a big gathering in outside of Austin, and this is a picture from the solar eclipse right outside of Austin, and this has become a little bit more of a metaphor for myself to help explain why is it that I learned about psychedelics back in 1972, decided to focus my life on it, and why have I kept going for 52 years on this path. And so I felt like the sun is being obscured by this darkness. And I felt like as I was growing up with stories of the Holocaust, stories of the Cuban Missile Crisis, how we could blow up the whole world, my confrontation with Vietnam and becoming a draft resistor and planning to go to jail as a nonviolent protest, that I've been motivated by fear of what we can do to each other, to the planet, just this terrible fear of what humans can do. And so it's this heart of darkness, but this brilliant light around this, when the eclipse is at its totality and you can see this light, for me that was, the darkness was wrapped in privilege. I had this really fortunate family situation, and I ended up having parents that said, even if they disagreed with what I wanted to do, they would help me do what I thought was most important. So I've not been overwhelmed by the darkness and the fear and the anxiety, which could have just sunk me down into a depression, but I've been motivated by it. And the privilege has helped me focus my energy. And so all over the years, I've felt like there's no reason for me to ever give up, that I had to use my privilege to try to reduce the chance that we would destroy ourselves and destroy the planet. And so it's still an open question, you know, how things are going. Yeah, so, but that's the eclipse. Okay. Let's see, this is not.
Did you take that picture?
No, I didn't. I didn't, but that would have been. Is there a clicker? Let's see, yeah, because this.
You want to play the video now?
Well, no, not yet. I just want to advance the slide, but it's not going. Ah, okay, great. Okay, so just to say that MAPS has raised over $150 million in donations, and thanks to those of you who are here that have donated. It's really been an honor to try to change the world together with the donors. But we've also raised, and this is a little bit outdated, but we've also raised about $140 million from investors. With the FDA rejection, I'd say about $250 million of value has been lost. So but over time, I think Lykos will succeed. The value will come back. MAPS is the largest single shareholder. We only own 40% of the for-profit company. We do appoint the majority of the board, but I think one of the big failures has been the MAPS board has not exercised its power. So, you know, David, you're saying some of the things here about Puerto Rico, and they're not actually exercising the autonomy that you do have here. So I think in many cases the MAPS board is the core of the problem. What happened here is we've given too much authority and tried to separate out the pharma company and let them run themselves. This is the MAPS logo as interpreted by Alex Gray, the psychedelic artist. Our logo is on the right-hand side. And the emphasis of this is that it's our understanding that it's not really a psychedelic drug that we're talking about. It's about the therapy. It's about the human connection. What heals people is not the drug, it's the context in which it's delivered. And so we just want to make that emphasis. Now, most of the pharma industry that's involved in psychedelics, and even Lykos, I think, is moving away from being a drug plus therapy company, and they're trying to be just drug companies. And the best, and in a way, very successful example is Johnson & Johnson with Spravato, with ketamine, which is approved without any kind of therapy and is approaching $1 billion in annual sales. So they consider that a massive success. It's not necessarily what's best for the patients, but it's what's best for the pharma company. When you don't provide ketamine with therapy, the results fade, and what do? You need to buy more ketamine. When you provide it with therapy, it lasts longer, you integrate it, and you don't need to buy as much ketamine. So now Stan Groff is my mentor, the leader, and many in the field. Psychedelics used responsibly and with proper caution would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology and medicine, or the telescope is to astronomy. So when we look at history, the telescope itself as a tool was highly controversial, and Galileo died under house arrest because of what he saw through the telescope that helped convince him that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. So when you get insights that are different from the religious powers, the powers that be, you can be in trouble for these insights. And so the telescope itself was very controversial. Now we don't think of the telescope as any kind of controversy. We've got the Hubble, we've got all these telescopes in space, we're learning enormous about the universe. So the hope is that one day psychedelics will also be seen as a tool, and what we learn from the psychedelics will not be used to sort of go back as Nixon did. What we learned from the psychedelics in the 60s is, why are we killing all these people in Vietnam? Why are we doing this? We're all in this together. So the hope is that as the telescope has evolved into just a tool, so psychedelics will do so as well. E.O. Wilson said this, and I think this is really what I felt when I first tried LSD. The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. So we have advanced our minds in such tremendous ways that it's miraculous, and yet our emotional and spiritual maturity is lagging behind. And that's why we have global warming. That's why we have nuclear proliferation. So I think when I sort of realized these things when I was 18, I felt, what tools can we use that can help us advance our spiritual and emotional maturity? And for me, the tools that were the most powerful for that were psychedelics. And the fact that they had been suppressed by Nixon was actually an advantage to me, in the sense that it made me think, what is Nixon see? Why is Leary the most dangerous man in America? Maybe he's onto something, and maybe that's a good thing for me to focus my energies on, to bring back the psychedelics. And to say that it's not just the psychedelics. So we had a little discussion on Necker Island was whether MDMA is a psychedelic or not. And it's not a classic psychedelic, but what I said is in order to kind of normalize psychedelics, I've tried to broaden the definition. So psychedelics can apply to dreams. It can apply to holotropic breath work, hyperventilation. It doesn't have to apply to a drug. And that helps us realize that we all have these mind-manifesting opportunities. And so the same way is to think about the insights you can get from psychedelics, you can get from going up into space. When we see our fundamental unity with the processes of nature and the functioning of the universe, as I so vividly saw it from the Apollo spacecraft, the old ways of thinking and behaving will disappear. It's a lot easier to give somebody LSD than shoot them up in space. So scaling psychedelics will be for scaling. It was very interesting when Sir Richard Branson was speaking to us the other night. He said the most memorable, important day of his, Jeremy, you asked him this question. It was really good. The most memorable and important day of his whole life was when he went up into space. So he's speaking about the insights you get when you're in the universe watching the Earth as one thing from a distance, when you get that perspective. So this is just to say, we might focus on psychedelics, but it's about the insights that you get from psychedelics more than the drug, and you can get these insights in other ways. Now, just to talk about the psychedelic renaissance, and this is just a slide of the various scientific papers, ending just a few years ago, but you could see this explosion of interest in psychedelics, and you can see it goes up in the late 60s, and then there's the backlash. And then it goes down for about 20 years, and almost all those papers were about the risks of psychedelics. They were not about new studies. They were about old studies. They were about LSD causes chromosome damage, all this. MDMA causes neurotoxicity. But in 1992, the FDA changed their approach and decided to reopen the door to psychedelic research. And that's what led to this gradual sort of renaissance and explosion of research. And most of these studies are LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, some are MDMA, but there's just an enormous interest now, again, in psychedelics. On the left-hand side is, the public psychedelic companies. There's just so many. In the background is all the names of them, but there are hundreds of now psychedelic companies. And what has happened is that around $4 billion has been invested in psychedelics since 2020. And in the entire time, from when I started MAPS in '86 to when there was the Hefter Research Institute, the Beckley Foundation, one or two other nonprofits, the total we've all raised is around $300 million in donations. So you can see, though, even though there are downsides from investor money, there also is major advantages in terms of access to capital and changing public consciousness, doing research into a lot of different things. So this kind of explosion of money into this field, that's what made it more difficult to raise more money from donations. But I don't want to speak, I think there's a lot of good that will come from the private investment into psychedelic companies. There will be all sorts of new things invented, including lots of new drugs that we're all looking forward to try, that some of us have tried some of them. And so there's going to be a lot of additional funds. I think the Lykos rejection by FDA will dampen investment for a little bit of time, but it will return. So just to show you a sense of progress, this was on Oprah and MTV. This is 23 years ago. This was brain scans of a woman that had used a lot of different drugs. So this was a SPECT scan. And this woman had used a lot of different drugs, and her mother in particular, worked at a drug abuse treatment center. And they said on TV, on Oprah and MTV, that they would give her a brain scan, and then they would reveal it on the TV show. And so this is what they claimed was her brain scan. This is completely graphically manipulated. What they've
Swiss cheese, right?
Swiss. This is the Swiss. You would not be walking and talking. What was so ironic is that this woman was on the TV show, was perfectly functioning normally, and they said this is her brain. So what they really did was they took every area that was below a certain amount of activation, and they just portrayed it as a whole. So it's.
I was shown this like 6 years later in school, in high school. I remember that MDMA causes holes in your brain.
Yes, it's frightening. Did you believe it when you were?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it looks like, yeah, this is real, or it looks like it's real. It's just incredible. So now, 10 years later, Oprah Magazine was sort of atoning. They did criticized the neurotoxicity research, and enough of it had sunk in. And so Oprah had one of her senior editors do a story at MDMA, and at the end of it, this reporter took MDMA herself and talked how valuable it was, which was incredible. There was just like one line in this article that, now I'm doing it. It wasn't a big deal about it being illegal. So then this was how a single pill can change your life. So Oprah went from propaganda on the negative side to propaganda on the positive side. So this is a magic pill. Everything you do is change it. But this just shows that it's been a lot of work to try to change cultural attitudes, and that they are changing. And more recently, this just was O Magazine, the new wave of psychedelics. So a lot of public perception has shifted from fear to hope, from fear about what this will do to hope for the therapeutic and other potentials of it. Now, as far as MDMA, I started MAPS in '86. 1992 is we started doing phase 1 studies through basic safety studies through the 90s. Starting in 2000, we worked on 16 years of what are called phase 2 pilot studies, trying to figure out who's your patient population, what is your dose, what is your therapy, what is your effect size to power the statistics, who don't you want to be in the studies, who it's too dangerous for. So we ended up then starting phase 3 in 2017 and 18, and as of December 2023, finally, now 37 years after I started MAPS, we were able to have Lycos submit the data to the FDA. The new drug application was accepted. Once you submit something to FDA, they have 2 months to look at the file and decide, is it complete? And they said yes, and then it started a 6-month review. And where things really started going wrong was this advisory committee on June 4th. And they, and I'm going to show you a video right next, just to show you a little bit about the mistakes that the advisory committee made, and then that led to the rejection on August 9th of the FDA. Just one thing before I turn on the video is that one of the things that is perplexing me that Lycos did not do, but on June 6th, 2 days after the FDA advisory committee, the Dutch State Committee on MDMA, which was filled with real subject matter experts, spent a year studying the data, put a book-length report about it, and they came to the exact opposite conclusion as the FDA advisory committee. They said efficacy was proven, safety was proven, and since there's a major unmet medical need, the Dutch government should immediately open up naturalistic studies. So I think that is something to consider also here in Puerto Rico. What they're saying is naturalistic studies are basically like what's going on in Australia, what's going on in Canada. It's compassionate use. And you don't have a control group. You can do a little bit of data gathering on safety and efficacy before and after. But I think a real possibility for Puerto Rico is to think about, is there the political will, even on a compassionate basis, to think about these naturalistic studies or compassionate use. Okay, so now, if we could, okay, so this is a video to give you a sense of the advisory committee and what the members thought compared to what the actual data was. It's in here. Yeah, and I think that's, yeah, if that'll start. Yeah.
From the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trials for PTSD. The clinical trials determined that 2/3 of the study participants were no longer meeting criteria for PTSD after 3 sessions with MDMA. And not only that, their results were sustained for over 6 months.
The FDA has designated it a breakthrough therapy.
So what happened?
Melissa Barone, I voted no.
Jess Fedorowicz, I voted no. Roger Intern, I voted no.
I voted no. I also said no.
No.
I said no.
Walter Dunn, I voted yes.
There are 2 yeses and 9 noes.
It was a total train wreck. The committee voted nearly unanimously against MDMA as an intervention for PTSD.
A key FDA advisory committee today rejected the use of a psychedelic drug to help patients struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder.
I'm going to save you the 9-hour meeting
Statistically significant difference from placebo of 8.91.
and give you the top 10 absurd, outrageous, like, blah, things that were said.
Lycos is a therapy called.
And share how a small group of radical activists appear to have manipulated the media and possibly derailed a federal regulatory process in a way that could end up denying millions of people a life-saving treatment. Let's get started. Number 10. The panelists kept talking like yada, yada, yada about functional unblinding.
Potential impact of functional unblinding on interpretability.
The functional unblinding clearly occurred.
What the potential impact of functional unblinding?
I voted no. The functional blinding, it didn't feel right.
This study was approved and it's designed by the FDA in 2017.
The FDA already knows that functional unblinding is a concern, that you cannot blind psychedelics effectively, and they approved the trials with this design anyway.
The FDA was very well aware of this issue. It's just that the panelists weren't. And that they weren't is not a problem of the study. It's perhaps a problem of the panelists.
One would have thought that this advisory committee would have some awareness of.
Oh, let's see. Did I break it? If I could have broken the advisory committee, I would have. Let's see. Well, you get the flavor of it. There's a lot more going on, but if it doesn't correct itself, I guess I can just go on.
The wheel of death is not going anywhere.
Okay. All right, let's just see. Yeah, it just goes through all these other different kind of reasons why some of the things they said is that the studies were not diverse, and so that they couldn't trust it because it wasn't diverse. 50% of the people in the second phase 3 study were non-white. They just had so many misinformations. They talked about how we had a very low dropout rate, and they couldn't trust it because we had a low dropout rate, and that normally, yes, it's in the VA did a study that took them 6 years. It was comparing 2 different therapies, prolonged exposure versus cognitive processing therapy. 916 veterans, and I don't know if you can fix it.
No worries.
Okay, but over half the people dropped out of the study because to confront the trauma in these ways, it's very difficult, and you're forced to confront the trauma over and over and over. So half the people dropped out of the study, and so we had hardly anybody drop out of the study. So they used that as a weapon against believing the results. They said your dropout rate was so low. So
Fact that these are long-standing and well-known issues with
You lost signal, the Wi-Fi?
I think, yeah.
Yeah, let's try it again. Sorry, guys.
And if it doesn't work, I can just go on.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, all right, we'll go on. Yeah. Anyway, the Dutch committee came to the opposite conclusion looking at the same data. That's what's really important. And these people, there's another part of this where a whole series of people saying, well, this is out of my depth, I really don't understand this, but I'm against it. So, they really weren't the right people to review it. All right, so the issue is now, what is our therapy? What is the therapy that we've developed? Because it's more about the therapy than it's about the drug. So all of the psychotherapy research that's been done demonstrates that more important than the kind of psychotherapy, whether it's prolonged exposure, cognitive processing, just Freudian analysis or anything, more important for the outcomes than the kind of therapy is what's called the therapeutic alliance, the trust and safety between the therapist and their patient. That is the key predictive factor for how people will get better. Because once you feel safe, you can do this work in many different contexts, in many different therapeutic approaches. So the first part of our thing is this building of this empathic rapport. And one of the parts of this that has also become very controversial is that at one point, we've had about 400 people through this therapy. At one point or another, every single person has asked the therapist if they've done MDMA. And we feel that it's critically important, although not essential, should never be required, but it's very important for therapists who are going to give something to their patients for them to know what they're giving to their patients in psychedelics. Now, traditional psychiatrists will say, I give electroconvulsive therapy to my patients. I'm not going to take it myself. Why should I? And I don't want to take antipsychotics that I'm giving to my schizophrenia or psychotic patients. And in both of those cases, they're right, because the ECT or the drugs are the treatment. But in psychedelic-assisted therapy, the therapist is the critical element in the treatment. And the therapy is more important than the drug. One of the critiques of the advisory committee meeting was that 40% of the people that were in our study had previous experience with MDMA or ecstasy at a party thing. So they said, oh, that makes them biased. Now they're more likely to have better outcomes. They're more likely to have fewer side effects because they've had this prior experience with MDMA. It turns out that the 60% that didn't have prior experience with MDMA did the same benefits as the 40%, and there were no fewer side effects in the 40% that had. So that was a completely false argument. But the important point is they've done MDMA and they still have PTSD. Again, it just demonstrates that it's not in the drug, it's in the context. All right, so the other part is this, this is the key part, is that this direction of the session is sourced from the participant's experience. So we don't use the word guide. We are not guides. We don't know the territory that the patients need to go through. They know, and their unconscious knows, they know the best, and we support what's ever emerging. So we call it inner-directed or self-directed therapy. We don't guide, we don't lead, but we support. We can ask questions, we can do different things, so it's not that you're never making an intervention. But the idea is that we let people come upon the worst things that have happened to them in their lives in their own time. It's an 8-hour session, too, so there's a lot of time the way that the MDMA works. And then this other part is that there is this belief, and this was criticized as like, mystical mumbo jumbo, but we believe that there's this inner healing mechanism to the psyche. So we all know that's true for our bodies. Our bodies get hurt, our bodies try to repair themselves. And we don't know how that happens. It's under our level of conscious awareness. Sometimes we can learn how to kind of get in there and stimulate our own immune system or in different ways. I think that'll be a big area in the future is the placebo effect. The placebo effect is really you think something is going to work and you somehow mobilize your resources to help make it work. But could we do that in a more conscious way? So when we say that there is this inner healing intelligence in the body, we say there's a parallel thing in the mind, and that's why we trust the process. That's why we support what's emerging. We think that people are able to manage whatever is happening if they're properly supported. So this inner healing intelligence is just part of trusting what's emerging. And you see this in shamanism. You see this in ayahuasca, that the shamans, they believe that what's coming to you is what you need to be looking at. So it's just the key element of the philosophy. We have a manualized treatment manual. We have it operationalized. We have adherence criteria. We can quantify how well somebody is adhering to the method. One of the advisory committee things was, your therapy is anything goes. It's nothing. It's not specific. And yet, as in that video would have said, Michael Midhoff, our lead psychiatrist, we had 90% adherence to the method. So we do have a specific method. It's in this, and it's up for free on the MAPS website for people to look at. And this is now just a critical point, is that in the work that was done in the 50s and 60s with LSD, and the work that was done in the last 20 years with psilocybin and ayahuasca and other things, there's a direct correlation between the depth of the mystical experience and how well people recover from depression, from addiction. So mystical experience, the depth of it is linked to therapeutic outcomes. And that is true for the classic psychedelics. But this shows that it's not true for MDMA. So on the left-hand side is scores on the mystical experience questionnaire, and on the x-axis is declines in the CAP scores. So there's no significance there. There's really basically no correlation. So that further supports our therapeutic approach. We're not trying to help people have a mystical experience. They are doing that with psilocybin and other things, where you think letting go, feeling this unitive experience is linked to therapeutic outcomes. But in our case, there are other benefits from having a mystical experience, but that doesn't correlate with a reduction of PTSD symptoms. So this is a key difference between MDMA therapy and the classic psychedelics. Now, MAPS is starting to think about globalization, and really this is, again, more from the nonprofit perspective. We want to really work around the world where there's a lot of trauma. We're talking about doing a project, and we first got MDMA into Somaliland, which I'll talk about in a second. But we've done trainings in Australia, Iceland, Bosnia, Sarajevo a couple times, and more to come. So there is a training that's going to be in Australia in November. So it's potential for Puerto Rican therapists, if there was an interest in that, we could send them to Australia for a 6-day training where it's watching videotapes of therapy sessions, going over the treatment manual. It's the way to prepare people to work with MDMA. We are working on scheduling one now in Ukraine. Sort of the way the world is working, the therapists that are going to do the Ukrainian training, it's been the last couple of months, they've finally convinced themselves that there are safe places to go in Ukraine that have not been bombed, and the males in Ukraine cannot leave the country. So the male psychiatrists and therapists are in Ukraine. So we had to decide, would we do it in Poland, would we do it in Ukraine? We want to do it in Ukraine. And the therapists are finally willing to go to Ukraine, but they're from Israel. They've got young kids, and now they think Israel's not safe enough for them to leave home for 10 days and leave their kids in case there's more missile attacks. So once once there is hopefully more peace soon in the Middle East, then we'll be able to have the therapists go to Ukraine. So these are the Israeli therapists. This was in Sarajevo. We've had 12 therapists from Ukraine that have come out of Ukraine, some of them males that got special permission, and this was about a year ago. It was very, we can take about 50 people at a time to train. This was outside in Iceland. It was just really beautiful. All right, so I'm just going to give you a bit of the data from our phase 2 study. Now keep in mind that FDA said that this was not persuasive, and but this is what we did find. It was published in Nature, our first one, our first phase 3 study, and this is the treatment. So again, what we've tried to do is to figure out how do we get the best results. Our goal was maximize patient outcomes. You know, there's another goal that I think is sort of much of the work of the other for-profit companies has been, and this sort of comes from tech, a minimum viable product. You know, what's the least you can do that is still good enough to get approval? You don't need fantastic outcomes. You just need statistical significance. There may be good reasons to think about what's the minimum viable product, because the cost will be less, and then you can scale it to be more people, so maybe more people get slightly less effective treatment. Maybe that's better, but that was not our approach. We had to get the best results to get over the stigma of psychedelics and to really persuade the regulators and others, the military and others, the VA, that this was worth adopting. So it's 3 MDMA sessions, 1 month apart, and within that, there's 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions. So there's 3 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions before the first session for preparation, for building the therapeutic alliance, and then there's 3 of these sessions for integration after each MDMA session, or therapy with inactive placebo. And so in our earlier research in phase 2, we discovered, to my surprise, that the 75 milligram dose group was very effective. And so we've changed our approach. It was 3 sessions of 120 or 125, but the first one now that everybody gets is 80 milligrams. Those people that are routed to the MDMA. So this is randomized. It's either therapy with inactive placebo, which is why people can tell the difference, and therapy with MDMA. The reason why we didn't have low-dose MDMA as the placebo, which is what I thought and was going to be the thing to do, and that was what I said in my dissertation was the solution to this, but we found that low-dose MDMA, 25, 30, 40, 50 milligrams, actually made people uncomfortable. So it wasn't quite enough to have the fear reduction, but it activated them. So people in those low doses still got better, but the people that got therapy with inactive placebo did even better than the people that got low dose. So then we went to the FDA, and this is what happened in 2017. We said, we can give you blinding, but you're going to make our job easier because the therapy component will be less effective than it was with no MDMA at all. And so that's why the FDA said, use this design. And then we also do 2 months after the last MDMA session to show even durability. We're not looking at 1 week after the MDMA or 2 weeks. You could say there's a psychedelic afterglow. So, and then 2 months is the follow-up data for FDA. So then you need longer durability data for insurance companies because this is labor intensive. It's 42 hours of therapy and it's with 2 people. The first person, often male-female teams. A lot of times people that have PTSD had childhood trauma as well and didn't have a well-functioning family. So to have a well-functioning male-female team can really help people restore, recover what they didn't get when they were growing up. But also, men and women see things differently, and so it's really helpful to have these different kind of perspectives. But it is labor intensive. So the durability you need for the insurance companies. 32% of the people that got therapy without MDMA, these are people that had PTSD over 14 years. This is severe PTSD. 90% of them had suicidal ideation. 40% had serious suicidal ideation. And 1/3 had what's called positive behavior, which means that they either actually tried to kill themselves, or they like bought a rope and decided not to use it, or went to a bridge and thought about jumping off but didn't do it. So these are the hardest cases, and 2/3 of them with the MDMA no longer had PTSD at the end of the treatment. And another 21%, so it makes it 88%, had what's called clinically significant reductions of PTSD. They still had PTSD, but their symptoms had reduced so much that it improved their lives. So that way, they're called responders.
Before you go on to the next slide, could you explain that last point there, like no longer meet requirements for PTSD
Yeah.
diagnosis?
Yeah, so that's the 60. So there's a gold standard measure called the clinician-administered PTSD scale. And that's required by the FDA, required by EMA, the European Medicines Agency. It's translated into loads and loads of different languages. So there's a way to use this clinician-administered PTSD scale to see if somebody qualifies for a diagnosis of PTSD. So they all did before the study, and then 2/3 of them no longer did after the study was over, after the treatment. So this was tremendously satisfying. Science in 2021 said they have a list of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of every year, and they said that our study, the first one that we just published, was one of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of 2021. What made this what made this even more satisfying is that as the last gasp of the drug war and the National Institute on Drug Abuse trying to stop what we were doing, 20 years before, Science had published, actually in 2003, Science had published a paper saying that all of this talk for up till then had been all about MDMA and serotonin. They said, oh, no, that doesn't seem to be such a problem now, but MDMA hurts dopamine and it could cause Parkinson's. And this was about animal studies in primates. And it was really like one dose, serious brain damage, you could get Parkinson's, and it just didn't make sense, and it didn't make sense, but it was published in Science. The editor of Science said taking MDMA is like playing Russian roulette with your brain, a really scary kind of a story. And we just kept objecting because a bunch of the primates were killed by overdoses in this study. And we'd done prior primate studies. None of them had died. Later, after a year of defending the study, the scientists said, oops, sorry, we gave methamphetamine instead of MDMA. Somehow or other. It was one of the biggest scandals of the journal Science and of science itself. And also, methamphetamine is stronger than MDMA. It takes fewer milligrams of methamphetamine to have a big effect. So they were giving the wrong drug in higher doses than they should, and they knocked off a bunch of these primates, and they hurt dopamine. And they should have known, but they published it anyway. So anyway, for Science to come around, it's the same way as Oprah sort of saying new good things about MDMA when she'd done the holes in the brain. So the safety data. This is transitory, non-serious, during the MDMA. You'll notice on the left-hand side the MDMA-assisted therapy. All of these adverse events are greater in the group with MDMA than they are in the placebo group, but none of them are that significant. Muscle tightness, decreased appetite, nausea, and they all go away at the end of the day. We really had a little bit more cardiovascular issues to the people that had placebo. What that means is when you start engaging your emotions and you start really working through different things, you can have elevated heartbeats and things. It's just, so we had more problems in the without the MDMA. Nobody became dependent on it. And suicidality thinking, these thoughts, were also greater in the group without MDMA than in the group with MDMA. But the most serious ones was this. We had one woman try to kill herself twice during the study. We had another woman who had such severe suicidal ideation that she checked herself into a hospital not to kill herself, and both were in the placebo group. So another advantage of having inactive placebo in the control group is that you know that whatever is happening, the side effects, they're due to the condition and to the therapy. They're not due to 25 milligrams or 30 milligrams of FDA. So you have of MDMA. So you have a better side effect profile from inactive placebo, which is also why the FDA chose that for us. So then our second phase 3 study, we shifted to moderate to severe PTSD. And what we showed, and this is I think also one of the criticisms at the advisory committee was, oh, your therapist could tell which group they were in, and therefore they would work much harder and much better in the people that got MDMA, and they wouldn't do so much in the people that just had the placebo. This shows that's totally not true. We had almost 50%, 47.6% in the group that had therapy without MDMA no longer had PTSD. Our therapists had gotten better from working on the first study and learned more and more how to deal with PTSD patients and in the 8-hour sessions. But when you add MDMA, it's 71.2%. And then there was also another about 16% that had clinically significant reductions of PTSD. So we had about a 12% group that were non-responders. So the results are pretty outstanding, and this really does demonstrate that the therapy itself, which also had a low dropout rate, was more effective than the traditional therapies. And I think it's because in an 8-hour session, you're listening to music, you're there, you can come on things that are difficult in your own way and your own time. You can navigate with it. You're not confronted with it. So I think we've developed what we think is a really effective therapy even without combining it with MDMA. Safety data is similar in this study, again, and this was what FDA asked us. In phase 2, all of our studies, we did ask people, do you think you got MDMA? Do you think you got full dose, this dose? The people that we negotiated with in 2017 to do the study left the agency, and the current group of people are more conservative, and the first people said, don't even bother asking. We know the blind isn't going to work that much. And the second one, though, we did do this. And what this shows is the people that got MDMA, you can see that either they're positive or they think they got MDMA is about 94%. And there's only a few that were, one out of 52 was sure they had the placebo when they didn't, when they had MDMA. And two couldn't tell. Yeah, you can tamp down your emotions in ways. But if you look here with the placebo group, what's pretty impressive is that more than 20% were positive they had MDMA or thought they had MDMA. So when we hear, oh, your blinding didn't work, this is terrible, actually 20% of the people that got nothing thought it was MDMA because they're in such a position to work on their issues and they're so supportive. And then, another 4.5% couldn't tell. So basically 25% were uncertain or thought they had MDMA, and 75, the rest were, about 75% were pretty sure, positive, or thought they had placebo. So this is the blinding, which is actually better than nothing. One of the good things is Lykos has partnered with Compass Pathways. The key issue is going to be scaling and equitable access. Unless there's insurance coverage, it's only going to be for self-pay people. It's not going to be for the people. Most of the people that have trauma like this are people that also cannot afford to pay for things themselves. So this was a new billing code for longer sessions. So how do you get insurance companies to pay? There's still not parity between physical health and mental health, but that's being discussed. There's 13 million people in the U.S., and we have to train tens of thousands of therapists. And so right now, the way the credentials have been with FDA, the first person needs to have a license. The second person can be an apprentice, can be in a position to get a license. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, here's this big question. How do we properly train therapists? This is another place where I think Puerto Rico could become a leader in the world. Right now, if you want to be a psilocybin therapist and you want to have a psilocybin experience but legal, you can go to Jamaica. You can go to the Netherlands. You can go to Costa Rica. You can go to Oregon. You can go to Colorado. If it passes in November, you'll be able to go to Massachusetts. But there's not a single place in the world where anybody can go for a legal MDMA experience as part of their training. Nowhere in the world. People are willing to vote drug policy reform for plants, but when you talk about synthetics, it doesn't pass. So one possibility could be that Puerto Rico could set itself up as a center for giving MDMA to therapists as part of their training, and then people from all over the world would come here for those experiences. We're trying to do something like this in Canada. It hasn't been set up yet. We had protocols from the FDA to do this, and we've trained our therapists this way, but it's pretty expensive, and it was only paid for by research. So one way to do it is unregulated. To just say, okay, these therapists will just break the law, and they'll get it underground. But that's particularly not good for like the VA therapists. For a lot of traditional people do not want to break the law. I don't know why, but I would say, well, I'll just say that as being a Vietnam War draft resister, I learned very early that there's a difference between what's moral and what's legal. And when we see how outrageous the drug war is and how immoral it is and corrupt it is, I don't respect I think it's okay to go with what you think is moral. But in any case, a lot of the therapists don't want to break the law. And we need to find some legal way. So that doesn't work. Off-label means that if MDMA gets approved for PTSD, doctors can prescribe it for other things. That's true for any drug. But off-label is not going to work because it's not covered by insurance. It will be too expensive, and the sponsor cannot sell or donate MDMA or any drug for an off-label purpose that they're aware of. So it's not going to work to just say, oh, we'll get it approved, and then doctors will prescribe it off-label, because it's going to be quite an expensive drug from LICO's perspective. Doing it in clinical study protocol is really possible, but it's quite expensive to scale. If we were to do something here in Puerto Rico, it would need to be a very simple protocol without a lot of data gathering. And then the state psychedelic plant medicine initiative, so far they don't include synthetics like MDMA. And so FDA regulatory innovations, we were hoping that there would be some way FDA would make this possible, but Lykos has decided this is way too controversial, and they're abandoning the whole idea, not even talking about therapist self-experience, and trying to block me and MAPS from even talking about it. So one of the things going forward in the future, and this is one of the ones I'm really excited about, is studies with adolescents or younger. The FDA will be requiring it, but the idea here is you want to train people closer to the trauma. You want to treat them closer to the trauma. We give kids ADHD drugs all the time when they're 6 or 7 years old, on a daily basis. So people freak out, oh, you're going to give a kid MDMA, but these are traumatized kids. But I will just share a story in the 80s. There was my neighbors across the street when MDMA was still legal. They did MDMA, and they really loved it, and they wanted to do it with their whole family. And they had a 7-year-old daughter. And so they said to me, should they work with their daughter? And I said, well, it's up to you. I really don't think it's that risky, but I wouldn't give her a full dose, give her maybe a half dose or something like that. And so they decided to do that. And so I met her the next day. I met the family the next day, and I said, to her, what happened when you were on MDMA? She said, well, I felt like I was up in heaven watching my mother, before she got pregnant for me, get ready to be a mother. And I was like, did you really think you were up in heaven watching your mother? And she said, well, I don't know. I just thought that. So I got the feeling she wasn't telling it as a story to get attention. That was really actually what she felt. Now, if you talk about the Native American church that uses peyote, or the ayahuasca communities, they don't have age limits. I went to a Navajo peyote ceremony on the Navajo reservation, and a Navajo man brought his 9-year-old son to take peyote with the rest of us. And so it sounds really scary in our Western context, but it's not really, and particularly for medical purposes. So this is going to be right now, FDA is blocking us from studying adolescents. They said only until adults, it's approved as adults. So these studies may take a time to implement. Here's another study that we really need to look at, which is right now, ketamine can be given to people on SSRIs. We require people to taper off their SSRIs, all their psychiatric medicines. Not because it's unsafe, but they blunt the effect of MDMA. Now, ketamine can be given to people on SSRIs, and that's one of its big advantages. Now, psilocybin, more and more, is also being given to people that are on SSRIs, and it doesn't seem to be hurting it. And there's been a lot of anecdotal reports of people who, underground therapists who have worked with people on SSRIs, and you just double the dose of MDMA, and they can have a full experience in a lot of cases. The worry has been serotonin syndrome, but that doesn't seem to happen. And with so many millions of people taking ecstasy all around the world, many of them on medications, you don't see problems from that either. So what we would really need to do is a dose-response safety study to give people on psychiatric medications. Because if you can keep, a lot of people don't want to withdraw from their medications. It's scary for them. But if you can keep them on their medications, help them reduce their PTSD symptoms, then it'll be easier for them to get off their medications. So this is another study that needs to come in the future, and this is going to be one of our really exciting projects that we're starting, MDMA for couples therapy. This is not something that Lykos will ever do because so far the FDA has only approved psychiatric medications for conditions that are in the DSM, that are diagnosable disorders. So couples therapy,
Marriage is not a diagnosis.
it may feel that way, but one of the people that came to the Necker Island was Javier Munez, who was from the FDA, and he's retiring this week. And what he said also to me a long time ago, but also this last few days, is that he thinks that even though FDA has never approved something which doesn't have a diagnosis attached to it, there's nothing in the law that prevents them from doing that. And so he thinks that we could start this in an academic way, and maybe with enough legal pressure at some point and enough, I think, further reduction of people's belief in the drug war, maybe we could get MDMA approved for couples therapy. But even if we don't, this research is really, really important. And if there's anything that people will pay for that's not covered by insurance, it's to save their marriages or to save their relationships. So even without FDA approval, this area of research is really important. And I do think that couples therapy research is going to prove that couples therapy is one of the very best uses of MDMA. I don't know how many of you used it for that purpose, but my wife and I try to do it every year for that purpose. And so from a scaling point of view, and this is also if there would be like new research in Puerto Rico that hasn't been done elsewhere, it's group therapy. That's the big area of research to reduce the cost, to help with scaling. My personal view is that the individual research with an individual patient and two therapists will work better. But when you do a group, the group integration process, I think, can make up for that. Because in a group, each person doesn't have quite as much time with the therapist, not as much time inner, they're more outer speaking, but they can really support each other in the integration process. So it could end up being that group therapy will end up outperforming or being as equivalent to individual therapy, but at less cost. So after October 7th happened, I started thinking in Israel, what can we do to help? And so now this is going to be 400 people are going to be going through group therapy, and it's people traumatized together. We are doing a lot of work. We've trained Palestinian therapists. We tried to start research in Jordan. So I was just in the West Bank meeting with the leading underground psychedelic therapist in the West Bank. There are underground therapists with psychedelics with MDMA in Iran even. It's way more extensive. I mean, these are small people. They're very, very careful, but there are psychedelic therapists even in Russia, all over. Not that many, but anyway, this is going to be a really important group therapy project. Lior Roseman at Imperial, now he's at Essex. There are small groups of Israelis and Palestinians doing ayahuasca and MDMA together. And that was happening before this latest war. And so the idea was, can these psychedelics, by helping you see our common humanity, be used in situations of conflict? Can this work for conflict resolution? And so Lior has done work with ayahuasca. He's brought Israelis and Palestinians to Spain for group ayahuasca sessions. And it does seem to be helping a lot. And he said there was one story of an Israeli soldier who, or formerly in the military, was part of these ayahuasca groups, and they started playing Arabic music. And he started it's like his instinct of fear just like, came over him. But the ayahuasca helped him sit through it. And then he started to realize how beautiful the music was, and that he could see the humanity of the Palestinians through their music. And so I think that this holds a lot of promise. We felt that in America, once we've done a lot of work with Israelis and Palestinians, we're going to do the harder case of Republicans and Democrats. So we're now talking about doing an MDMA group in Spain. But right now, there's very few Israelis and Palestinians that even want to be in the same spaces together. So it's going to be difficult, but we're going to pursue that. So just to give you a range of the sense of the other studies. So cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy was developed inside the VA by Candace Monson, and it's moving from the designated patient to the family setting. So this is where it's one PTSD patient, but you bring in their partner and they both go through the therapy. And so in 2014, through the help of Richard Rockefeller, who was my main thought partner for 6 years, and his cousin, Senator Jay Rockefeller, who was on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, they persuaded the VA to let us finally, I'd been starting in 1995, but they finally said that they would let Candace work with us, but she couldn't use her VA affiliation. They wouldn't refer veterans. We had to pay for it ourselves. And they wouldn't let her use vets even, but we could do this study with her. And we did 6 dyads where both got MDMA, and the results were better than anything she'd ever done before, both in reduction of PTSD and strength of the relationship. So it's just pointing to this idea that when you start helping families, you magnify the potential. And often the PTSD patient gets the attention, and their partners who are sort of traumatized by their PTSD of their partner get ignored. And so this is an effort to try to do this. So this was done tremendously successfully. We've done studies with autistic adults on the autism spectrum, but looking at social anxiety. One of the people in this study couldn't look people in the eye, and after the therapy, she got a job at Starbucks, where you're supposed to look people in the eye twice and smile at them. And for somebody who's autistic, that's super hard, but she was able to get over her social anxiety, learn about her own emotions, learn about reading body language. So this is a really promising area to go. We've done work with people who are scared of dying, with life-threatening illnesses, anxious about it, with MDMA. That worked well. And so now this study is just completed in Toronto. It's combining MDMA with cognitive processing therapy. And so what Ann Wagner said is that the MDMA therapy looked like our inner-directed therapy, but the cognitive processing was used before and after in the prep and integration. And she thought that could work well, but she still had the MDMA sessions like opening up the inner-directed therapy. So this is part of this political strategy. I wanted to go to those people that have developed other non-drug psychotherapies and not say, oh, what you've got doesn't matter anymore. We've got MDMA and it's better than everything else. What I've said is MDMA is just a tool, and it can be used in many different therapeutic contexts. And we would like you all to explore how MDMA could be used in your own context, in your own therapies. And I think that's why we don't have the opposition from the PTSD therapists that don't use psychedelics. They're supportive because we're showing that they can enhance what they do, if they want to, with MDMA. And prolonged exposure, that's one of the ones that I said had like 55% dropout rates. So this is Barbara Rothbaum at Emory with the Atlanta VA, and Edna Foe had developed prolonged exposure, and she's going to do this project in Israel. This was at Sunstone outside of Baltimore. This was another of these studies where you bring in the partner. So this is cancer patients and a concerned significant other. Again, the second person doesn't have to have a diagnosis. The first person has adjustment disorder, but both get MDMA. So you think if your partner is going through cancer, everybody in the family is suffering. And how do you give both members? And the results were just tremendous. Then inside the VA, I started talking to the VA in 1995. It took 26 years until October 12, 2021 for the first vet to receive MDMA inside the VA from VA therapists. And these were the two therapists, Shannon Remick and Ali Cahill, who were able to do this project. So when you think about the number of veteran suicides that have happened since 1995, when I started talking to the VA about MDMA, and when they finally first did this, it's well over 150,000 people committed suicide. So it just shows the resistance, but also the persistence. And over time, when the need is great enough, people will start looking for alternatives. And that's what's happening now. Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA is doing great work. But the thing that's so unique about her work is that she has looked at multi-generational trauma. So we all know about there's trauma from your life. But, and Jeremy, you talked about this, you can pass down trauma through epigenetics to your children. And this is either through the mother or the father. And so what Rachel has identified is these markers epigenetic markers that are like set points for anxiety, depression, fear. And what she's done early stages, we need to do more of this, but it looks like if you have successful therapy, these markers will change. That you do not need to pass trauma down to your children if you work through your trauma yourself. That's really the promise of what Rachel is looking at. She's done studies with Holocaust survivors and their children. Now she's doing some of these same measures before and after some of these vets get treatment. But I think this is the key thing. We have generations, hundreds, thousands of years of multi-generational trauma being passed down. And you can have these conflicts that just go on and on forever. But can you break the cycle? And so Rachel's research suggests that it is possible to break that cycle. This is now Portland, Oregon VA. This is group therapy. This is going to be 4 therapists for 6 people. They each get 2 MDMA sessions. The first one is individual. The second is in a group. And he's now done 2 cohorts of 6. And what he said is all 12 of those people have said that it was very helpful, but they all wish they had one more group session for a 3rd session. So that gets back to the model that we had 3 MDMA sessions. But we thought for people that are really vulnerable, really traumatized, it might be safer to give them an individual session first before you have them do MDMA in a group. It's different than the ones in Israel. They're going to give them group therapies both. So we'll see how that goes. This is something that the VA is going to do. This is a direct head-to-head comparison, which has never happened before, of MDMA therapy with another therapy. This is with cognitive processing therapy. The work that Ann Wagner did was to combine MDMA with cognitive processing therapy. This is going to use an active placebo, which is D-amphetamine. I think this will act similarly to low-dose MDMA. And I also think that the therapists will be able to tell the difference between whether they got MDMA or D-amphetamine, which does have some emotional things, but it's not as fear reduction as MDMA. So we shall see. And these are now 2 efforts inside the VA to combine MDMA with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. Leslie in San Diego is going to give MDMA just to the vet and not to their non-vet partner, and Brandy wants to give MDMA to both people. And this was just an important one by Awake, and this was MDMA for alcohol use disorder. So that's something that we could also consider for Puerto Rico, because what it turns out is that these people that had just come out of detox, when you get them in therapy, what happens is they're processing traumas, and they use the alcohol to run away from the trauma. And so it's not a surprising thing. But if you help them process their trauma, then they don't feel the need to go to the alcohol as much. And so that's what this study showed. And then MAPS, I had assumed, as I think many of us did a couple of months ago, that Lykos would succeed and that FDA would say yes. And so what MAPS, the nonprofit, has now been focusing on is globalization, global access for humanitarian projects where it's not about the profits, it's about healing, and it's about training local people, and it's more from philanthropy. So we do want to prioritize global communities with the largest burden of trauma and the fewest resources for treatment. And the vision has been, for me, this idea of, can we create a world of net zero trauma by 2070? So it's multiple generations away. It's a long time in the future, but it's an idealistic goal. Can we indeed make it so that the burden of trauma on humanity as a whole is not increasing. Net zero trauma doesn't mean no trauma. It just means that the burden of multi-generational trauma and new traumas, which I think is going to increase over the next decades from global warming. There's an estimate of a potential billion climate refugees by 2050. So I think this is in some ways relatively conservative. You know, can we really make it so humanity as a whole doesn't keep getting worse and worse and worse? And in order to really do that, we need a metric to figure out how we measure success or outcomes. So the King of Bhutan and Bhutan has done gross national happiness measure, which is used now all over the world to compare countries on gross national happiness. So we're actually having people meeting with the King of Bhutan to say, do they want to help create gross national trauma? And I think that we need a measure of national trauma in order to see, can we make progress over the next 45, 50 years. And so one of the things that I've really liked, one of the statements I had is if your goals are something that you can accomplish in your own lifetime, they're too small. So this is something will definitely be after my life is over. Can we really move towards this gross national trauma? This is the circles around it are different areas of trauma that we would need to sort of combine and measure in order to get this metric. But I think that this metric could be key, and it could focus attention on trauma. And so Somaliland is the first project. We've actually had 2.1 grams of MDMA arrive in Somaliland, and it was for a protocol to give therapists MDMA as part of their training, because these are people that don't come from a psychedelic culture. They've never had MDMA. A lot of them have never smoked pot. They do khat, they do other things there, but they've never had the psychedelic experience. And so there's been about 4 people now, 4 therapists in Somaliland, and the results were incredible. This one woman, we talk about mind-body stuff. This one woman had abdominal pains for decades, and it went away after MDMA. Another therapist said she wanted her mother to do it, and she wanted her sister to do it. And the main message, Dale Armstrong is an American psychiatrist who has sort of adopted this village, this group in Somaliland. And what we're seeing is that MDMA seems to work cross-culturally. And so for those of you that have maybe heard about the octopus study, MDMA was given to octopuses. Octopuses are solitary creatures. When you give them MDMA, now they hang out with other octopuses. And this was done by Johns Hopkins researchers. It was really well done. And octopuses still process serotonin. Even though 600 million years ago, the octopus and human line went in different directions. So I think that this idea that there's something that is pre-verbal, evolutionary conserved, works with all humans, works with other animals. One of the things that actually came about at the Necker meeting with Joseph Barsuglia, I don't know if you know about this, but the study in dogs, there's an interest now in working with traumatized dogs and giving them MDMA to see if that might impact them. We had to do dog and rat studies, toxicity studies in '85 before we can get into humans. And so I actually did give MDMA to my dog, or to 2 dogs actually I had. And I had this hyperactive female German Shepherd that was really great and loving, but she would come up to you, she would put her paws on your shoulders. She was kind of dangerous to be with in a way, but under MDMA, she would come almost right up to me, stop 6 inches before my face, and then sort of she knew I was there. All of a sudden, it was safer to be with her. The only problem is that she did not do the integration work, and it didn't last. And I didn't want to keep giving her MDMA all the time. And so in Denmark, this is another project that we're in the process of building. We've trained Danish therapists. There's a bunch of Syrian refugees that were made citizens in Denmark, and they're all traumatized in families. And so we're now, what they've said, the therapists have said, is that this project would be second generation who speak Danish, are less religious than their parents, know they're never going back to Syria, and want to commit to working on their trauma. So this is just one of the series. And we're hoping to do 4 or 5 of these over the next year and a half or 2 years, and then go for a big audacious grant from the TED Audacious Project or somewhere else. But this is sort of the idea of, I think the FDA process is critical because, again, medicalization leads to legalization, also gets insurance coverage. But and Lykos will succeed, I think, eventually. They will succeed, but we need to think about the rest of the world. And so that's really where philanthropy is going to come in. So that is the presentation, and thank you for having me here. And I'm really glad that this is your first event for your foundation. I'm so proud to be here at the beginning of this, and look forward to seeing how the foundation develops and your work over the years.